On a southern plantation, cruelty was not hidden. It was a performance. Samuel Carter, a husband bound in chains, was forced to watch as his wife Ruth was taken and broken by their master, Charles Whitfield. Every scream was meant to shatter him. Every lash was meant to silence him. And for years, it worked. He bowed his head, clenched his fists, and swallowed rage in silence. But then came the night Ruth whispered she was with child, and Samuel realized escape was no longer enough. On Whitfield's birthday, with fire in the fields and blood in his hands, Samuel made his choice. This is not the story of a man who endured. This is the story of a husband who turned suffering into vengeance and left a legacy written in blood. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. Dawn broke over the Whitfield plantation with cruel indifference. The first light crept through the cracks of the slave quarters, falling across Samuel Carter's face. His eyes opened immediately. He never truly slept deeply anymore. Beside him, Ruth stirred, her breathing changing rhythm as she woke. Samuel turned to look at his wife, noticing the dark shadows beneath her eyes, testament to another night spent more in fear than rest. "Morning come too soon," Samuel whispered, his large hand gently brushing a strand of hair from her face. Ruth nodded, her eyes meeting his briefly before looking away. "Always does," she said. The quarters around them began to stir with quiet movement. The other enslaved families rose without speaking much. Morning talk was dangerous, drawing attention. Samuel sat up slowly, his broad shoulders hunched in the small space. At 32, his body was strong from endless labor, but each morning brought new aches, new reminders of yesterday's work. "You feeling all right?" he asked Ruth, keeping his voice low. "I'm here," she answered, which wasn't really an answer at all. Samuel understood. Being all right wasn't something that existed in their world. Being here, surviving another night, that was the most they could claim. Outside, the plantation bell rang, signaling the start of the workday. Samuel helped Ruth to her feet. Her hands were rough from washing, cooking, and cleaning for the big house, but to Samuel, they remained precious things. They dressed quickly in their worn clothes, neither speaking about the way Ruth winced as she moved. The overseer's voice carried across the yard. "Carter! Master wants you at the big house." Samuel froze, his stomach tightening. Being called to the big house never meant anything good, especially not this early. Ruth's eyes widened with fear. "Go on," she whispered. "Don't make him wait." Samuel stepped outside, the morning air cool against his skin. He kept his eyes lowered as he approached the overseer, a man named Jenkins, whose sunburned face seemed permanently twisted in disgust. "What you waiting for, boy? Master said now." Jenkins spat, hand resting on his whip. Samuel walked the dirt path toward the white-columned house that loomed over the plantation. Each step felt heavier than the last. The grand house, with its polished windows and fine curtains, stood as a monument to wealth built on broken backs. Master Charles Whitfield waited on the porch, dressed in fine clothes despite the early hour. At 45, Whitfield carried himself with the confidence of a man who had never known a day of want or fear. His lips curled into what might have been mistaken for a friendly smile if Samuel hadn't known better. "Ah, Samuel," Whitfield said, his voice smooth as honey, but with poison underneath. "Good morning to you." "Morning, master," Samuel replied, eyes fixed on the porch steps. "I have some work to discuss," Whitfield said, gesturing for Samuel to follow him inside. "The north field needs clearing, and I'm thinking you're the man to oversee it." The words were ordinary, but Samuel felt his skin crawl. This wasn't about fieldwork. It never was when Whitfield used that tone. Inside the house, the air smelled of beeswax and expensive tobacco. Samuel stood still in the entrance hall, knowing better than to move without permission. Whitfield walked ahead, then stopped suddenly. "Oh, Ruth should be here for this discussion too," he said, turning back with false casualness. "Jenkins!" The overseer appeared at the door. "Fetch Ruth," Whitfield ordered. "Tell her to come to my study." Samuel's heart began to pound. He kept his face blank, though every muscle in his body tensed. 15 minutes later, Ruth was brought in, her eyes downcast, hands clasped before her. "There she is," Whitfield said warmly, as if greeting an old friend. "Now we can begin." He led them both to his study, a room filled with books Samuel wasn't allowed to read, and maps of lands he'd never see. Once inside, Whitfield closed the door, and the pretense dropped away. "Stand there, Samuel," he commanded, pointing to a corner. "I need to discuss Ruth's duties with her." Samuel knew what was coming. This discussion had happened before. He stood frozen as Whitfield approached Ruth, lifting her chin with one finger. "You've been avoiding me, Ruth," he said softly. "That hurts my feelings." Ruth trembled, but remained silent. "Look at your husband, Ruth," Whitfield suddenly demanded. "Look at him while we talk." She raised her eyes to Samuel's, and the pain he saw there burned into his soul. Whitfield moved behind her, placing his hands on her shoulders. "Samuel," Whitfield said, eyes locked on the enslaved man, "I want you to understand something. Everything here belongs to me. The land, the crops." His hands tightened on Ruth's shoulders. "Everything!" What happened next was violence disguised as ownership. Samuel was forced to watch, to witness his wife's humiliation and pain, while Whitfield's eyes never left Samuel's face, searching for the breaking point. For the moment, rebellion might flash across his features. Samuel stood still as stone, his rage buried so deep it might have reached the center of the earth. His face remained blank, his eyes eventually lowering in what Whitfield would read as submission. But inside, Samuel was memorizing every second, storing each moment like fuel for a fire yet to be lit. When it was over, Whitfield straightened his clothes with casual indifference. "Now," he said, returning to his businesslike tone, "about that north field. I want it cleared by the end of the week." The next morning arrived with a heaviness that seemed to press down on the entire plantation. Samuel woke before dawn, his muscles stiff from another night spent on the hard dirt floor. Beside him, Ruth still slept, her breathing shallow. He watched her for a moment, noticing how even in sleep her brow remained furrowed, as if she couldn't escape worry even in dreams. Outside, birds began their morning songs, unconcerned with the suffering beneath them. Samuel rose quietly, careful not to wake Ruth. Today would be a long day of clearing brush in the north field, the task Whitfield had ordered after yesterday's cruelty. The memory of what happened in that study burned inside Samuel's chest. "You awake already?" Ruth's voice came softly from behind him. Samuel turned. "Didn't mean to wake you." "You didn't." She sat up slowly, wincing slightly. "Sun's not even up proper yet. Better to be ready before the bell," Samuel said, helping her to her feet. They prepared in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. When the bell finally rang, they joined the stream of people heading to the fields. Overseer Briggs stood at the edge of the property, whip ready, counting heads as they passed. "Move faster!" he shouted, cracking the whip near the feet of an older man who stumbled. "No lazy workers today." The sun climbed higher as they worked, beating down without mercy. By mid-morning, sweat soaked through Samuel's shirt as he swung his axe against stubborn tree roots. Ruth worked nearby with other women, clearing smaller brush and gathering it into piles. Every so often, their eyes would meet across the field, a silent reminder that they weren't alone. When the water break finally came, Samuel made his way to the oak tree where a single bucket of water waited for all the field hands. He drank quickly, saving some in a small cup he'd fashioned from bark. Moving carefully to avoid drawing attention, he brought it to Ruth, who sat in the shade of a distant tree, away from most eyes. "Drink," he said, offering her the water. Ruth took it gratefully. "Thank you." Her fingers brushed his as she took the cup. Samuel glanced around, making sure no overseers were watching. Briggs had wandered to the far end of the field, shouting at someone. For a moment, they were as alone as they ever got. "Samuel," Ruth said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I need to tell you something." Something in her tone made Samuel's heart beat faster. "What is it?" Ruth looked down at her hands, then back up at his face. "I'm with child." The words hung in the air between them. Samuel felt a rush of emotions, joy, fear, and then, like a stone dropping into still water, realization. "How long?" he asked, his voice catching. 2 months, I think." Ruth's eyes filled with tears. "Samuel, I don't know. I don't know if it's mine," Samuel finished for her. The truth they both understood, but hadn't spoken aloud. Ruth nodded, a tear sliding down her cheek. "I'm sorry." Samuel turned away, his hands clenched into fists. For a moment, the rage he kept buried rose to the surface, threatening to break free. He wanted to scream, to run to the big house and tear Whitfield apart with his bare hands. His breathing came fast and shallow, but then he felt Ruth's hand on his arm, trembling but steady. "I'm sorry," she whispered again. Samuel looked at her, really looked at her. Her face was lined with worry, her eyes pleading for understanding. In that moment, something shifted inside him. The rage didn't disappear, but it changed, hardening into something more focused, more determined. He took her hands in his. "Listen to me," he said, his voice low but firm. "That child is ours. You hear me? Ours." Ruth stared at him, unsure. "But—" "No," Samuel cut her off. "I don't care what that man did. This baby is coming into our family, our blood, our love." Fresh tears spilled from Ruth's eyes. But these seemed different. "You mean that?" "With everything I am," Samuel answered. He placed his hand gently on her stomach, still flat beneath her dress. "This is our child. And I promise you, Ruth, this baby won't grow up like we did. Somehow, I'll make sure of it." Ruth leaned forward until her forehead touched his. For a brief moment, they shared the same breath, the same hope. A shadow fell across them, and they quickly moved apart. But it wasn't an overseer. It was Aunt Millie, the elderly woman who worked in the kitchen house. Her thin frame seemed frail in the harsh sunlight, her hands gnarled from years of work. She couldn't speak. Her tongue had been cut out years ago as punishment for some forgotten offense, but her eyes missed nothing. Aunt Millie looked at them, then at Ruth's stomach, where Samuel's hand had been. Her eyes softened with understanding. She gestured for them to follow her a few steps away, where she bent down as if searching for something in the grass. As she worked, she began to hum a tune Samuel had heard before, a work song the field hands sometimes sang. But today, the melody seemed different. Aunt Millie hummed certain notes longer, changed the rhythm in subtle ways. When she glanced up at them, her eyes were intense, meaningful. "What's she trying to tell us?" Ruth whispered. Samuel listened closer. The tune reminded him of something, a song about rivers and stars, about following water north, a song about escape. The water break ended with Briggs's shout, "Back to work, now!" Aunt Millie straightened up, patted Ruth's arm once, and shuffled back toward the kitchen house. As she went, she continued humming, the strange melody floating back to them on the breeze. That evening, after another day of back-breaking work, Samuel sat outside their quarters, watching the sun set behind the plantation house. The fence that surrounded the property stood stark against the reddening sky, a boundary he had never crossed. Beyond it lay woods, roads, and eventually, free states he'd only heard about in whispers. From the direction of the kitchen house came Aunt Millie's voice, still humming that same melody. Samuel listened, really listened, trying to understand what she was telling them. The song spoke of water paths, of stars to follow, of ways unseen by watching eyes. As darkness fell, Samuel stared at the fence, seeing it differently for the first time. Not as an unbreakable barrier, but as a challenge that could be met. Aunt Millie's song faded, but its message remained clear. Escape might be possible. 2 days passed in a blur of sweat and watchful silence. Samuel worked the fields with new purpose, his mind turning over possibilities while his hands moved mechanically through familiar tasks. Each night, he and Ruth exchanged whispers in the darkness, planning, hoping, fearing. On the third evening after Ruth's revelation, they returned to their quarters exhausted but alert. The small, cramped shack they shared with 3 other enslaved families offered little privacy. But tonight, the others had been sent to work late in the tobacco drying shed. For once, they were alone. Samuel sat on their thin pallet, massaging his aching shoulders. Ruth moved quietly around their small space, arranging their few belongings. Neither spoke until a soft scratching came at the door. Aunt Millie slipped inside like a shadow. Her thin frame seemed almost ghostly in the fading light. Though well into her 60s, she moved with purpose, her eyes sharp in her weathered face. She carried a small bundle wrapped in cloth. "You shouldn't be here," Samuel whispered, though he was glad to see her. "If they catch you out of the kitchen quarters after dark?" Aunt Millie waved away his concern. She couldn't speak with her voice, but her hands moved in gestures they had come to understand over the years. Tonight, her movements were urgent, insistent. "She wants us to follow her to the back corner," Ruth interpreted, watching the old woman's hands. Samuel nodded, and they moved to the darkest part of the shack, where the roof slanted low and shadows gathered thick. Aunt Millie settled on the floor, motioning for them to join her. When they sat, she unwrapped her bundle. Inside was a scrap of yellowed cloth. At first glance, it looked like nothing special, just a piece of old fabric with dirt stains. But as Aunt Millie smoothed it out on the packed earth floor, Samuel realized it was a crude map. "What is this?" he whispered, leaning closer. Aunt Millie pointed to various marks on the cloth, then to herself, then made walking motions with her fingers. Her eyes burned with intensity. "You've been somewhere?" Ruth guessed, studying the old woman's face. Aunt Millie nodded vigorously. She pointed to the largest mark on the cloth, what looked like a house, then gestured around them. "The Whitfield plantation." "This is a map of escape routes," Samuel said, understanding dawning. "You've helped others get away before." Aunt Millie's eyes crinkled at the corners, a smile without moving her lips. She nodded again, then traced a line from the house mark to what appeared to be a series of squiggly lines. "What's that?" Ruth asked, pointing to the squiggles. Aunt Millie made undulating motions with her hand, then pointed down at the floor. "Underground?" Samuel guessed. "There's something underground?" The old woman's eyes lit up. She made more elaborate gestures, mimicking walls, a low ceiling, darkness. "Tunnels," Ruth breathed. "There are tunnels under the plantation." Aunt Millie tapped her nose, confirming Ruth had understood. She then pointed to various spots on the map, showing where entrances might be hidden. Samuel's heart began to race. "How long have you known about these?" Aunt Millie held up her hands, fingers spread wide, then repeated the gesture twice more. 20 years, Ruth translated. "You've known for 20 years?" The old woman nodded, her face solemn. She pointed to herself, then made a running motion, then shook her head sadly. "You never tried to escape yourself?" Samuel asked. Aunt Millie touched her throat where her tongue had been cut out, then made a cradling motion with her arms. "They did that to you when you had children," Ruth said softly. "You stayed for them." Tears welled in the old woman's eyes. She made more gestures, children being taken away, sold, gone forever. Then she pointed to Ruth's stomach and fixed Samuel with a stare that needed no translation. "Don't let this child be born into slavery." Samuel took Ruth's hand. "We won't," he promised. "If there's a way out." We'll take it. Aunt Millie smiled again with just her eyes. She tapped the map once more, then folded it carefully and tucked it into Ruth's dress pocket. Rising with some difficulty, she made a series of quick gestures. 3 days, Ruth interpreted. She says we need to be ready in 3 days. There's less guard patrol on Sunday night. Samuel nodded. Then, that's when we'll go. After Aunt Millie left, Samuel and Ruth sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of their decision settling around them. Are we really doing this? Ruth finally asked, her voice barely audible. Samuel squeezed her hand. We have to try. For the baby. Over the next 2 days, they prepared as carefully as they could. Samuel stole a small knife from the tool shed and sharpened it on a stone when no one was looking. Ruth gathered food scraps from her work in the washing yard, crusts of bread, apple cores, anything that wouldn't be missed, and dried them by hiding them near the hot pipes in the washing room. Each night, Samuel slipped out to watch the guard rotations, memorizing the patterns of the men who patrolled the plantation borders. He noticed that the guard near the north fence always took a longer break around midnight, disappearing for nearly half an hour to drink from a flask he kept hidden in the hollow of an old oak tree. Aunt Millie provided more information through her coded humming and gestures, which guards were heavy sleepers, which dogs would bark at strangers, where the tunnel entrance near the old well was hidden. Each piece of knowledge was another spark of hope. For the first time in years, maybe in his entire life, Samuel felt something beyond endurance. He felt possibility. On the night before their planned escape, Samuel and Ruth lay on their pallet, speaking in whispers so quiet they were almost thoughts. Are you afraid? Ruth asked, her breath warm against his neck. Yes, Samuel admitted, but I'm more afraid of staying. What if they catch us? Samuel had no answer that wouldn't frighten her more. They both knew the punishment for attempted escape. Whipping at best, death at worst. We won't be caught, he said instead. Aunt Millie has helped others before. Ruth was quiet for a moment. Do you think there's really a place where we could be free? Where our child could grow up without chains? I have to believe it, Samuel said. Otherwise, what's the point of any of this? They fell silent as footsteps passed outside. Just another enslaved person heading to the outhouse, not a guard. When the danger passed, Ruth turned in Samuel's arms to face him. Tomorrow, then, she whispered. Samuel placed his hand gently on her stomach, feeling a fierce protectiveness for the tiny life growing there. Tomorrow, he agreed. We move at midnight. He held her close as she drifted to sleep, his mind racing with plans and fears. Outside, a whip-poor-will called, its lonely cry floating across the plantation. Samuel listened, wondering if birds sang differently in free states. Tomorrow, we move, he whispered against Ruth's hair, allowing himself, for the first time, to truly hope. The next evening came with a heavy blanket of humid air that clung to the skin. Samuel had finished his work in the fields early, managing to slip away when Overseer Briggs wasn't looking. In their quarters, he and Ruth moved with quiet purpose, each motion deliberate and controlled, despite their racing hearts. We leave in 2 hours, Samuel whispered, sliding the sharpened knife into his boot. Just after they ring the night bell. Ruth nodded, her fingers trembling slightly as she packed a small bundle. A spare cloth, the dried food scraps, and a tiny carved wooden bird Samuel had made for her years ago. Her hand rested briefly on her stomach, a gesture that had become habit since she told him about the baby. Aunt Millie will meet us by the old well, she said, voice barely audible even in the quiet room. She'll show us the tunnel entrance. Samuel checked outside their doorway, scanning for any unusual movement. The evening looked normal. Other enslaved people returning to quarters, some washing up at the communal barrel, others too tired to do more than stumble toward their sleeping pallets. I think we're clear, he said, turning back to Ruth. No one suspects anything. Ruth came to him then, pressing her forehead against his chest. I'm scared, Samuel, she admitted. but I'm ready." Samuel wrapped his arms around her, feeling how slight she was, how precious. "We'll be free before sunrise," he promised. "We just need to—" The door crashed open. Overseer Briggs stood there, whip in hand, flanked by two other white men with rifles. His face twisted into an ugly smile beneath his matted beard. "Well now," he drawled, "looks like someone's making plans." Before Samuel could react, the men surged forward. Rough hands grabbed him, twisting his arms behind his back. He struggled instinctively, managing to land a solid kick to one man's knee before Briggs cracked the whip, the tip slicing across Samuel's cheek. "You try that again, boy, and I'll have your eyes," Briggs spat. They dragged Samuel outside, another man pulling Ruth behind them. The evening air felt suddenly cold against Samuel's skin as they were marched toward the center of the quarters where a crowd was forming. Other enslaved people were being herded from their cabins, forced to gather in a circle by men with torches and guns. In the center stood Charles Whitfield, immaculate in his white suit despite the heat, twirling a silver-headed cane between his fingers. "Ah, the happy couple," Whitfield said when the overseers pushed Samuel and Ruth into the circle. His voice carried the false pleasantness that always preceded his worst cruelties. "I hear you were planning a trip." Samuel's blood turned to ice. Someone had told. Someone had betrayed them. His eyes scanned the crowd desperately, looking for the informant. But all he saw were downcast faces, people afraid to meet his gaze. Then he spotted Aunt Millie at the edge of the gathering, her thin frame shaking, tears streaming silently down her face. "Nothing to say," Whitfield continued, stepping closer. He smelled of expensive cologne and brandy. "No explanation for the food you stole? The knife in your boot? The little map that was found?" Samuel maintained his silence, keeping his eyes lowered. Anything he said would only make things worse. "Sir," Ruth began, her voice small but steady. "Please." Whitfield's hand cracked across her face with such force she stumbled to her knees. "I didn't give you permission to speak, girl." Samuel lurched forward instinctively, only to be yanked back by Briggs and another overseer. "Oh ho!" Whitfield laughed, spinning to face the gathered slaves. "Did you see that? Our Samuel still has some fight in him. Even after all our lessons," he turned back, leaning in close to Samuel's face. "But I think you need another lesson about who owns what on this plantation." With a nod from Whitfield, Briggs forced Ruth to her feet and tore the back of her dress open with a sharp yank. The crowd made a collective sound, part gasp, part moan, as Ruth stood exposed, her back already marked with old scars. "10 lashes for the woman," Whitfield announced, stepping back. "And make sure her husband watches every single one." Briggs grinned, uncoiling his whip. "With pleasure, sir." The first lash came with a whistle and crack that seemed to split the air itself. Ruth's body jerked, but she made no sound. Samuel strained against the hands holding him, his world narrowing to nothing but Ruth's trembling back and the white-hot rage boiling inside him. The second lash. The third. By the fourth, Ruth had fallen to her knees again, small whimpers escaping her clenched teeth. By the seventh, her blood had begun to spatter the ground around her. Samuel felt something breaking inside him, not his spirit, but the chains of caution and patience that had bound him for so long. He watched Ruth suffering with dry eyes now, something cold and hard crystallizing in his chest. After the 10th lash, Ruth lay crumpled on the ground, unconscious or nearly so. Samuel had stopped struggling, standing utterly still between his captors. "Now," Whitfield said, adjusting his cuffs as if he'd just finished a minor business matter, "I believe there's one more thing to address." He stepped over to Ruth's prone form and grabbed her by the hair, lifting her face. "Wake up, girl." "We're not finished." Ruth's eyes fluttered open, glazed with pain. "Bring them both to the house," Whitfield ordered. "The rest of you stay here. No one moves until I say so. Two overseers dragged Ruth's limp body toward the big house. Samuel was forced to follow, a rifle barrel pressed against his spine. Behind them, the gathered slaves stood in helpless silence, watching as Whitfield led the procession up the wide steps of the mansion's porch. At the door, Whitfield turned to Samuel, his face alight with cruel anticipation. "You need to understand what happens when you forget your place," he said. "When you try to take what belongs to me." He reached out and stroked Ruth's cheek possessively. "Everything here belongs to me." They were taken to Whitfield's study, a richly appointed room with leather chairs and bookshelves filled with volumes Samuel wasn't allowed to read. Ruth was thrown onto a chaise lounge, leaving smears of blood on the expensive fabric. Samuel was forced to his knees near the door, a rifle trained on his head. "You'll watch," Whitfield said, removing his jacket and carefully hanging it on a wooden stand. "You'll watch and remember who has the power here." What followed was worse than any nightmare Samuel had ever endured. Whitfield's assault on Ruth was deliberate, unhurried, designed to break both her body and Samuel's spirit. Ruth's eyes, when they occasionally met Samuel's across the room, held nothing but pain and apology, as if she had somehow failed him by being victimized. When it was over, Whitfield straightened his clothing and called for Briggs to take them back to quarters. Ruth could barely walk, her fresh whip wounds reopened and bleeding again. Samuel was allowed to carry her, but the gesture felt like another of Whitfield's cruelties, letting him hold what he couldn't protect. The slave quarters were silent when they returned. Everyone had been sent inside, but Samuel felt their eyes watching from darkened windows as he carried Ruth to their cabin. Briggs shoved them inside with a final warning about what would happen if they tried to run again. Samuel laid Ruth gently on their pallet. In the dim light, her face was ashen, her breathing shallow. He tore strips from his own shirt to clean her wounds, working with trembling hands. "I'm sorry," he whispered over and over, though the words felt hollow, useless. Ruth didn't respond. Her eyes remained closed, her body occasionally shuddering with pain. When he had done all he could for her, Samuel retreated to the corner of the room. He sat with his back against the wall, knees drawn up, staring at nothing. His hands were clenched so tightly that his nails had cut into his palms, leaving small crescents of blood. The night deepened around them. Outside, crickets chirped, oblivious to human suffering. A guard passed by, boots crunching on the path. The ordinary sounds of the plantation continued, as if nothing had happened, as if the world hadn't just ended. Samuel uncurled his bleeding hands, looking down at them in the darkness. These hands that had worked Whitfield's fields. These hands that had failed to protect his wife. These hands that had never struck back. "No more," he whispered to himself, so quietly the words were barely breath. "No more." Dawn broke across the Whitfield plantation, painting the sky in streaks of pale gold and crimson. Samuel had not slept. His eyes burned from watching over Ruth through the night, tending to her wounds whenever she whimpered in pain. As the first light crept through the cracks in their cabin wall, he rose stiffly from his vigil. Ruth's breathing had steadied, though her face remained drawn with suffering even in sleep. Samuel covered her gently with their thin blanket, then stepped outside into the cool morning air. The slave quarters were silent. No one dared speak of what had happened yesterday. Not yet. Samuel stood motionless, his gaze fixed on Whitfield's grand white mansion across the fields. It gleamed in the morning light, like a bone bleached by the sun. The beauty of it made his stomach turn. For years Samuel had endured. For years he had swallowed his rage, bowed his head, and prayed that patience would somehow lead to freedom. But as he stared at that house, something crystallized within him, hard and sharp as diamond. Escape was no longer enough. Running would never free them from the memory of what Whitfield had done. Only blood could wash away such stains. The morning bell rang, calling the enslaved to their daily labor. Samuel moved mechanically to join the others gathering near the overseer's cabin for assignments. Briggs stood there, smirking as Samuel approached, clearly expecting to see a broken man. Samuel kept his eyes down, his face carefully arranged in the mask of submission he had perfected over the years. But behind that mask, his mind worked with terrible clarity. "Carter," Briggs called, "you're on tobacco today, and if I catch you slacking, you'll get what your woman got." Several workers glanced at Samuel, then quickly away. No one spoke. No one dared show sympathy openly. "Yes, sir," Samuel replied, his voice flat. In the fields, under the climbing sun, Samuel worked methodically, his hoe rising and falling in perfect rhythm. But as he worked, he studied everything around him with new eyes, noting the location of tools, counting the overseers, marking the times when Whitfield left the house for his daily ride. During the water break, Samuel approached Jacob, a young man who had been on the plantation only a year, but whose eyes held the same barely contained fury Samuel now embraced. "Hard day," Samuel said quietly, passing Jacob the water dipper. "Every day's hard," Jacob replied, watching Samuel carefully. "Some harder than others." Samuel wiped sweat from his brow. "Sometimes a man can only take so much hardness before something breaks." Jacob's eyes narrowed slightly. "What breaks? The man or the thing making him suffer?" Samuel held his gaze. "Depends on who's stronger in the end." This exchange, seemingly innocuous to any overseer who might overhear, marked the beginning. Throughout the day, Samuel sought out others. Elijah, whose brother had been sold away last month. Martha, whose daughter had caught Whitfield's eye recently. Daniel, who carried scars across his back that rivaled Ruth's. To each he spoke in careful code, testing their resolve, planting seeds of rebellion disguised as commiseration. Some responded with subtle eagerness, others with fear, but none betrayed him. The shared suffering of the plantation had created a foundation of trust that Samuel now built upon with deliberate care. As dusk approached, Samuel made his way to the kitchen garden where Aunt Millie worked, pulling weeds with gnarled hands. Though mute, she communicated with remarkable clarity through gestures and expressions. When she saw Samuel approaching, her eyes filled with tears, and she began to tremble. Samuel knelt beside her, pretending to help with the weeding. "I don't blame you," he whispered. "You tried to help us." Aunt Millie shook her head frantically, her hands forming shapes that Samuel had learned to read over the years. She warned of danger, of death, of consequences beyond imagining. "I know the risk," Samuel replied, pulling a stubborn weed. "But running isn't enough anymore. His blood will free us more than his mercy ever could." Aunt Millie's weathered face creased with sorrow. She gestured toward the quarters, toward Ruth, then made the sign for baby, followed by the sign for death. "I know what we could lose," Samuel said, his voice barely audible. "But think about what we've already lost. Our dignity, our humanity, our children born into chains." He paused, his hands stilling in the dirt. "I can't live another day watching him take what isn't his." Aunt Millie studied him for a long moment. Then, slowly, she reached into her apron pocket and withdrew a small object wrapped in cloth. She pressed it into Samuel's palm, a carved wooden key. Samuel stared at it, uncomprehending. Aunt Millie's hands moved again, telling a story of underground rooms, of passages built by the old master for smuggling, of ways beneath the big house that even Whitfield didn't know existed. "You'll help us?" Samuel asked, closing his fingers around the wooden key. Aunt Millie nodded, her eyes reflecting both fear and determination. Then she made the sign for time, little time, before shooing him away as an overseer passed nearby. That evening, Samuel returned to find Ruth awake, propped painfully against the wall of their cabin. Her eyes were clearer than he expected, burning with a feverish light. "They're saying you talk to people today." she whispered when he knelt beside her. "They're saying you have a plan." Samuel dampened a cloth and gently wiped her forehead. "Rest," he urged. "Don't worry about what people say." "Samuel." Ruth caught his wrist with surprising strength. "I know that look. I've seen it building in you for years." He didn't deny it. Instead, he helped her drink some water, then tended to her wounds with fresh herb poultices he'd managed to gather. Night fell fully outside their small window. Samuel lit a single candle, its flame casting long shadows across the dirt floor. From beneath their sleeping pallet, he retrieved the hoe he had brought back from the fields, against all rules, hidden under his shirt. Ruth watched silently as he took out a smooth stone he had also secreted away. With methodical precision, Samuel began to sharpen the edge of the hoe against the stone, working the metal into a crude but deadly blade. The soft, scraping sound filled their cabin. Samuel worked with single-minded focus, his face set in lines of grim determination. The candle flickered, casting his shadow large against the wall, a giant bending to a task of terrible purpose. Ruth didn't speak. She didn't try to stop him. Instead, she watched, her eyes reflecting the candlelight and something else, a mirror of the cold resolve that had crystallized in Samuel's heart. Outside, a whippoorwill called into the darkness. Inside, metal scraped against stone, and vengeance took shape in Samuel's hands. 5 days had passed since Samuel began sharpening more than just his blade. The morning sun beat down on the tobacco fields as he worked alongside Elijah, their hoes rising and falling in steady rhythm. Samuel kept his voice low, just loud enough for only Elijah to hear over the sounds of labor. And the Lord said unto Moses, "Stretch out thine hand over the land of Egypt for the locusts, that they may come upon the land and eat every herb of the land." Samuel paused, wiping sweat from his brow. "Even all that the hail hath left." Elijah nodded slightly, understanding the message beneath the scripture. "The Lord's plagues broke Pharaoh's hold," he murmured back. "Egypt suffered until the slaves were freed." 10 plagues, Samuel said, his eyes scanning for overseers before continuing. "We only need one." The overseer's whip cracked nearby, and both men fell silent, bending their backs to their work. When the danger passed, Elijah whispered, "Jacob and Daniel are with us. Martha, too. How many more?" 7, maybe 8. Elijah struck the earth with his hoe. "People are scared, but they're also tired of being scared." Samuel nodded. "Tell them to watch for signs. When the Master celebrates his birthday, that's when the Lord will visit his judgment." The plantation buzzed with whispers of Whitfield's upcoming birthday feast, just 2 weeks away. Every year, he invited neighboring planters to show off his wealth and his power. The big house would be filled with white men drinking expensive wine, eating fine food prepared by enslaved hands, laughing loudly into the night. "The stables first," Samuel continued, keeping his tone even as if discussing the weather. "Fire will draw them out. Then the wine." "Wine?" Elijah asked. "Ruth knows herbs, not just for healing." Samuel paused as another worker passed nearby. When they were alone again, he added, "Not to kill, just to weaken. Make them slow when they need to be fast." By midday, the heat had become unbearable. Workers slumped in whatever shade they could find during the brief rest period. Samuel made his way to the edge of the field, where Ruth worked, pulling weeds, despite her still healing wounds. Her face was drawn with pain, but her eyes brightened when she saw him. "You shouldn't be working yet," he said softly, offering her water from his gourd. "Staying in bed makes me a target," she replied, taking a small sip. "Better to look useful." Samuel glanced around to ensure they weren't overheard. "Can you still find those berries? The ones that made old Master Whitfield sick 3 summers ago?" Ruth's eyes widened slightly. "You mean to—" "Not kill," Samuel interrupted. "Just distract. When men are fighting their own stomachs, They fight others poorly. Ruth was quiet for a moment, her hand instinctively moving to her belly where their child grew. "There's a patch behind the smokehouse," she finally said. "I can gather them slowly. No one will notice if I take a few each day." "Be careful," Samuel warned. "If anyone asks." "I know how to keep secrets," Ruth said with a sad smile. "I've kept them my whole life." The afternoon dragged on, the sun merciless, but something had changed in the fields. Where before there had been only the dull rhythm of forced labor, now there was a current, invisible but powerful, running between certain workers. A glance here, a nod there, the smallest gestures carrying the weight of dangerous hope. Martha passed Samuel a piece of cornbread at supper and whispered, "My cousin in the kitchen. She'll help with the wine." Old Ben, who worked the stables, mumbled as Samuel walked by, "Hay's been extra dry this summer. Catch fire real easy, I'd wager." Even those not directly involved seemed to sense something. The atmosphere in the slave quarters had shifted from despair to something else, something tense and expectant, like the air before a storm. That night, after most had fallen asleep, Aunt Millie appeared at Samuel and Ruth's cabin door. She made a series of quick hand gestures, then beckoned Samuel to follow. Ruth, who had been dozing fitfully, squeezed his hand. "Go," she whispered. "Learn what you need to know." Samuel followed Aunt Millie through the darkened plantation. They moved like shadows, pausing whenever the night watchman passed nearby. Aunt Millie led him past the vegetable gardens, beyond the smokehouse, to an old tool shed that had fallen into disuse. Inside, she moved with surprising sureness for her age, pushing aside empty barrels to reveal a trap door set into the packed earth floor. She produced the wooden key she had given Samuel days before, demonstrating how it lifted a hidden latch. The trapdoor opened silently, revealing a narrow set of stone steps descending into darkness. Aunt Millie took a small candle stub from her pocket, lit it with flint and steel, then led the way down. The air below was cool and damp, smelling of earth and age. Samuel had to stoop slightly as they moved through the low tunnel. The walls were reinforced with timber beams, the floor packed dirt. Aunt Millie's candle cast dancing shadows as they walked. "How long have these been here?" Samuel whispered, amazed. Aunt Millie held up 3 fingers, then made a gesture indicating generations. 3 generations? The old master built these? She nodded, then pointed forward. The tunnel branched in 3 directions. Aunt Millie took the middle path, which Samuel realized was leading them directly toward the main house. After walking for what seemed like several minutes, they reached a section where the tunnel widened into a small chamber. Wooden crates lined the walls, some rotted with age, others seemingly newer. Aunt Millie pointed to these, then made the sign for whiskey. "Smuggling," Samuel realized. "The old master used these tunnels for smuggling goods." Aunt Millie nodded, then continued forward. Eventually, the tunnel ended at a steep set of stairs leading upward. At the top was another trapdoor. Aunt Millie put her finger to her lips, then very carefully pushed it open just an inch. Samuel peered through the crack and nearly gasped. They were directly beneath Whitfield's study. He could see the underside of fine rugs, the legs of expensive furniture. Aunt Millie eased the trapdoor shut, then led Samuel back the way they had come. At another junction, she took the left branch, which led to the wine cellar. The right branch, she explained through gestures, emerged in the stables. "Perfect," Samuel whispered, the plan solidifying in his mind. "They'll never expect us to come from below." As they made their way back toward the entrance, Samuel's mind raced with possibilities. The tunnels changed everything. They could move unseen, strike from unexpected directions, disappear again just as quickly. Back at the trapdoor entrance, Aunt Millie gripped Samuel's arm with surprising strength. Her eyes were intense in the candlelight as she made a series of urgent gestures. "Yes," Samuel nodded. I understand the risk. But we can't keep living like this. Aunt Millie's weathered face showed both fear and resignation. She pressed the wooden key firmly into Samuel's palm, closing his fingers around it. Then she made one final gesture, pointing to the moon, then drawing a circle in the air. 2 weeks, Samuel confirmed. When the master celebrates his birthday, we'll make sure it's his last. The Whitfield mansion glowed like a grand ship in the night, every window ablaze with candlelight. Fine carriages lined the curved driveway, disgorging wealthy planters in their finest clothes. Their wives rustled in silk dresses, jewels sparkling at their throats and wrists. Music drifted from the open windows, a string quartet playing in the corner of the ballroom while servants weaved through the crowd with silver trays. Samuel stood in the shadows of the kitchen, watching. He wore the clean white jacket Master Whitfield insisted upon for special occasions, when he wanted his best slaves displayed to his guests. In the bustle of the kitchen, no one noticed how Samuel's eyes took in every detail, calculating, waiting. More wine for the main hall, the head cook barked, pushing decanters toward 2 young women. Samuel caught Martha's eye as she lifted a tray. She gave him the smallest nod. The poisoned wine was already circulating. Ruth had harvested the berries for days, crushing them with her slender fingers into a paste that Martha's cousin had stirred into several bottles. Not enough to kill, Samuel had been clear about that, but enough to bring sweats, dizziness, and stomach pains. Through the kitchen window, Samuel could see Daniel and Elijah at the edge of the grounds, their dark figures barely visible as they moved toward the stables. They carried small pouches of stolen gunpowder from the plantation's hunting stores. "You, Carter," the overseer called from the doorway. "Master wants you serving in the main hall. Says to show you off to Senator Parker. Something about your carpentry skills." Samuel lowered his eyes. "Yes, sir." Inside the grand dining room, Master Whitfield held court at the head of a table laden with food prepared by enslaved hands. 30 guests, all white men of property, and their elegant wives, laughed at his jokes and praised his hospitality. The room stank of perfume, tobacco, and the sour breath of men who'd been drinking since midday. "Ah, here he is," Whitfield said, catching sight of Samuel. "Come here, boy. The senator wants to see the man who built my new cabinets." Samuel approached with his eyes downcast, the perfect picture of submission. Inside, his heart hammered against his ribs. The wooden handle of a kitchen knife pressed against his ankle, hidden in his boot. "Fine specimen," the senator said, examining Samuel like he was livestock. "Strong back, good hands, doesn't look too intelligent, which is a blessing. Smart ones cause trouble." Whitfield laughed. "Oh, he knows his place. Had to teach him once or twice, but he's learned well." He patted Samuel's arm possessively. "Hasn't he, boy?" "Yes, master," Samuel murmured. Through the tall windows, Samuel could see the first flickers of orange light beginning to lick at the stables. It was time. As if on cue, a woman's scream pierced the air. "Fire! The stables are on fire!" Chaos erupted. Guests rushed to the windows while Whitfield bellowed for the overseers. In the confusion, Samuel slipped back toward the kitchen. He found Ruth there, her face tense with fear and determination. "It's starting," he whispered. She pressed something into his hand. "The key to the tunnel." "Be careful," she whispered back. The mansion emptied as men rushed out to save the valuable horses. Women clustered on the front porch, exclaiming in horror as flames leaped into the night sky. No one noticed Samuel and 4 other men slipping into the study, closing the door behind them. Samuel unlocked the trap door beneath the Persian rug. One by one, they descended into darkness. They would emerge from the tunnels at different points, some to block the exits, others to start new fires, and Samuel to find Whitfield. By the time Samuel emerged from the wine cellar tunnel, the poison had begun its work. Several guests were doubled over, clutching their stomachs. Others looked dizzy, confused. Overseers who had drunk from the same bottles staggered as they tried to organize a bucket line for the stable fire. Samuel moved through the chaos like a shadow. Outside, the night had transformed into a hellish scene. The stables fully engulfed, sparks drifting toward the cotton storehouse, which had mysteriously caught fire as well. Enslaved men and women who weren't part of the plan stood watching, their faces reflecting flames and dawning realization. Then Samuel spotted him. Whitfield, shouting orders from the front steps, his face twisted with rage and bewilderment as his perfect night collapsed around him. "Master Whitfield!" Samuel called, his voice carrying over the roar of flames. Whitfield turned, shock registering on his face at Samuel's tone. No longer submissive, but commanding. "What are you—" Whitfield began, then stopped as he saw the knife in Samuel's hand. "You asked me once if I understood my place," Samuel said, advancing slowly. "Tonight, I'm showing you yours." Several guests watched in horror. Overseers reached for their weapons, but found themselves surrounded by kitchen knives, pitchforks, and burning branches wielded by people who had spent years beneath their whips. Samuel grabbed Whitfield by his fine coat, pressing the blade to his throat. "Tell them," he growled. "Tell them what you did to my wife. Tell them how you made me watch." "You're dead for this," Whitfield spat, but his voice trembled. "Maybe," Samuel agreed, "but you'll be dead first." He pressed the knife harder, drawing a thin line of blood. "Tell them!" Fear finally broke through Whitfield's arrogance. "It was my right," he gasped. "Their property. She's property." Samuel looked into the eyes of the gathered planters and their wives, seeing their fear, their disgust, not at Whitfield's admission, but at Samuel's defiance. "She was never yours," Samuel said, "and neither was I." The knife sliced across Whitfield's throat in one clean motion. Blood sprayed across Samuel's white jacket as the plantation owner dropped to his knees, clutching at his neck, eyes wide with disbelief. Around them, the carefully planned chaos continued to unfold. The main house had caught fire now, flames licking up the eastern wall. Enslaved people who had lived their lives in fear were standing tall, holding weapons, watching their tormentors flee or fall. Samuel found Ruth by the garden gate, her face illuminated by the burning mansion. He pulled her into his arms, heedless of the blood on his clothes. For the first time in years, he felt something like freedom coursing through his veins. "It's done," he whispered against her hair. "You did it," she said, looking up at him with wonder. "He's really gone?" Samuel nodded, suddenly overwhelmed by the enormity of what they had done, what could never be undone. The grand mansion that had been a place of torture was now a funeral pyre, sending sparks into the night sky. For one perfect moment, they stood together beneath the open sky, no longer bound by another man's cruelty. Around them, others were embracing, crying, or simply staring at the flames in silent awe. Then Ruth stiffened, her fingers digging into Samuel's arm. In the distance, they heard it, the pounding of hooves, growing louder. Many hooves. "The militia," she whispered, her voice tight with terror. "Samuel, they're coming." Ruth clutched Samuel's arm, her eyes wide with fear as the sound of approaching horses grew louder by the second. The sound of hoofbeats thundered across the plantation grounds, cutting through the roar of flames and cries of celebration. Samuel tightened his grip on Ruth's hand and looked across the burning estate. The dancing figures of newly freed men and women froze as the realization spread like a cold wave. "Run!" Samuel shouted, his voice carrying across the yard. "To the woods! Now!" But it was too late for many. The militia burst through the main gates, 30 men on horseback with torches and rifles. Their leader, Sheriff Davis, fired a shot into the air. "Kill the rebels! Take any you can alive for hanging!" Gunfire erupted. A man who had been dancing near the burning stable fell first, his chest blooming red. A woman screamed as a bullet tore through her shoulder. The celebration transformed into terror in seconds. Samuel pulled Ruth toward the tree line, looking desperately for familiar faces in the chaos. He spotted Aunt Millie waving frantically from the edge of the woods, her thin frame silhouetted against the darkness. "This way," Samuel called to those nearby. "Follow me!" A small group formed, 10, maybe 12 people running for their lives. Behind them, militia riders cut down those too slow to escape, their boots trampling bodies already fallen. The screams of the captured rang out as soldiers dragged them from their hiding places. Samuel's lungs burned as he ran, half carrying Ruth, whose pregnancy slowed her steps. They had almost reached the tree line when a rider spotted them. "There! The ringleader!" The militiaman spurred his horse toward them, raising his rifle. Samuel pushed Ruth toward Aunt Millie. "Go! I'll hold him off." "No!" Ruth cried, stumbling forward. The rider fired. The bullet whistled past Samuel's ear. He turned to face the man, ready to sacrifice himself to buy the other's time. Then came another shot. Not from the rider, but from the woods. One of the escaped men had found a pistol. The militiaman tumbled from his saddle, clutching his side. "Run, Samuel!" the shooter called. "We'll cover you!" Samuel sprinted the last few yards to the trees, reaching for Ruth, who stood waiting with Aunt Millie. Just as his fingers brushed hers, another shot rang out from behind. Ruth gasped, a small, startled sound. Her hands went to her stomach, and she looked down in confusion at the spreading red stain on her dress. "No," Samuel whispered, catching her as she collapsed. "No, no, no!" Aunt Millie grabbed his shoulder with surprising strength. "Carry her! We must go deeper!" 2 men helped lift Ruth. Samuel cradled her against his chest, his heart hammering with fear as they plunged into the dark forest. Behind them, more gunshots, more screams. The smell of blood and gunpowder mixed with the smoke from the burning mansion. They ran for what felt like hours, stopping only when they reached a small creek deep in the woods. Samuel laid Ruth gently on a bed of fallen leaves, his hands shaking as he tore strips from his shirt to press against her wound. "Ruth," he pleaded, "stay with me." Her eyes fluttered open, clouded with pain. "The baby," she whispered. "Samuel, the baby." Aunt Millie knelt beside them, her weathered hands moving Ruth's aside to examine the wound. Her face, usually so careful to hide emotion, crumpled. She shook her head once, a tiny movement. Samuel understood. The bullet had struck Ruth's lower belly. Their child, his child or Whitfield's, it didn't matter, was lost. A low animal sound escaped Samuel's throat. He bent over Ruth, his tears falling on her face. "I'm sorry," he choked out. "This is my fault. All of it." Ruth reached up to touch his cheek, her fingers leaving a smear of blood. "No," she said, her voice surprisingly firm despite her weakness. "We chose together. We chose to fight." Around them, the small band of survivors huddled in the darkness. 7 in all had made it this far. Samuel, Ruth, Aunt Millie, 2 field hands named Isaac and Jeremiah, a house servant called Martha, and a boy no more than 14 named Will. Their faces showed the same mixture of grief, terror, and disbelief. Aunt Millie set to work on Ruth's wound, using moss to stop the bleeding, and herbs she somehow had kept hidden in her pockets. The old woman's fingers moved with practiced skill, her silence more comforting than words could have been. "Will she live?" Samuel asked, his voice breaking. Aunt Millie nodded slowly, but pointed to Ruth's stomach and shook her head again. Samuel sat back on his heels, the weight of everything crashing down on him. They had killed Whitfield. They had set fires and taken up arms. And for what? A few moments of illusory freedom before the world crashed back down on them with redoubled cruelty. "I should never have," he began. Aunt Millie struck him, a sharp, stinging slap across the face. Her eyes blazed with fury. She pointed at Ruth, then at the sky, making a sweeping gesture with her arm. Martha translated, having spent years learning to understand the old woman's gestures. She says, Ruth must live for the story to matter. She says the sky saw what happened tonight, and it will remember. Through the night, they took turns standing watch, while the others rested. Ruth slipped in and out of consciousness, her breathing shallow but steady. The bleeding slowed under Aunt Millie's care. When dawn broke, they could hear distant shouts and dogs barking. The hunt had begun. "We need to move north," Isaac said, "toward the Ohio." "Ruth can't travel," Samuel said, not taking his eyes from his wife's pale face. "We'll carry her," Jeremiah offered. "We can make a stretcher." But before they could move, Ruth began to cry out in pain. The bullet had triggered labor, her body expelling what could no longer live. Aunt Millie and Martha huddled around her, blocking the men's view with their bodies, working to ease her suffering. An hour later, it was done. Aunt Millie wrapped something tiny in a piece of cloth torn from her skirt and handed it silently to Samuel. He looked down at the bundle so small it fit in one palm. His child, a son or daughter, he would never know. In a clearing a few yards from their hiding place, Samuel dug a small grave with his bare hands, his tears falling into the dark earth. The others stood in a circle, heads bowed. Even young Will removed his cap, holding it over his heart. Samuel placed the bundle in the ground, his hands gentle as if the child could still feel his touch. He covered it with soft earth and placed a single wildflower on top. "Forgive me," he whispered to the tiny grave. "Forgive me for not giving you a world where you could live free." 7 days had passed since the burial. Samuel walked beside the makeshift stretcher where Ruth lay, her face thin but her eyes clear. The survivors moved through a thick swamp, water up to their knees, the smell of rotting plants heavy in the air. Aunt Millie led the way, her frail body somehow finding strength to push through the murky water. She pointed to solid patches where they could step safely. "How much farther?" Isaac asked, his voice low. He and Jeremiah took turns carrying the front of Ruth's stretcher, while Samuel never let go of the back. Aunt Millie held up 3 fingers, then pointed to the sun. 3 days, Martha translated. "If we keep moving." Samuel looked down at Ruth. "Can you hold on that long?" She nodded, reaching for his hand. "I can feel my strength coming back a little." The bleeding has stopped. They had traveled only at night for the first few days, hiding during daylight. But as they moved farther from the Whitfield plantation, Aunt Millie had led them deeper into swampland, where even dogs couldn't follow their scent through the water. Now they moved by day, staying off any paths or roads. Young Will sloshed ahead, keeping watch. His sharp eyes caught movement in the trees. "Someone's coming," he whispered, ducking low. Everyone froze. Samuel lowered Ruth's stretcher to a small island of dry ground and picked up a thick branch. They waited, barely breathing. 3 figures emerged from the brush, 2 men and a woman, all black, their clothes ragged and wet. "We mean no harm," one man called softly. "We're running too." Samuel kept his branch raised. "From where?" "Bradford Plantation," the woman answered. 2 days south of here." Samuel studied them, still suspicious. "How'd you find us?" The second man stepped forward. "Old Leah told us to look for Millie's group in the cypress grove. Said you'd be heading north." Aunt Millie's face lit with recognition at the name. She nodded to Samuel, confirming the story. "You know about us?" Samuel asked, lowering his weapon. The 3 looked at each other, then back at Samuel. The first man spoke in an awed voice. "Everyone knows about you. You're the ones who burned Whitfield's mansion. You're the husband who cut the master's throat." Samuel felt a chill run through him. "How do you know that?" "It's in the songs now," the woman said. "The songs travel faster than people. Overseers caught 2 men singing about it yesterday. They whipped them bloody, but the men kept humming even as they bled." She began to sing softly. a melody that followed the rhythm of fieldwork. Master thought his power strong, but the slave husband proved him wrong. When the master touched his wife, Samuel Carter took his life. Samuel stared at her, stunned. His name was in a song. Their story was being told in whispers and melodies across plantations. "May we travel with you?" the second man asked. "We heard you know the way north." Aunt Millie nodded before Samuel could answer. She made a gathering motion with her hands. "Strength in numbers," Martha explained. The new group joined them, introducing themselves as Daniel, Moses, and Sarah. They carried small bundles of food, which they shared willingly. As they traveled, they told stories of what had happened since Samuel's revolt. "Planters are scared," Moses said as they rested that evening. "They've doubled the guards, shortened our chains, but it doesn't matter. Something's changed in people's eyes." "What do you mean?" Samuel asked. "Hope," Sarah said simply. "They saw that a master could bleed like anyone else." Ruth stirred on her stretcher. "All those lives lost," she whispered. "Was it worth it?" Sarah knelt beside her. "My sister was hung last year for spilling tea on the mistress's dress. At least your people died fighting." The next day brought them to a small creek where the water ran clear. They stopped to drink and wash the swamp mud from their clothes. While the others bathed, Samuel sat beside Ruth, helping her sip water from a cupped leaf. "I dreamed of our baby last night," Ruth said quietly. Samuel's throat tightened. "What did you dream?" "That he was waiting for us, in a place with no masters." She touched Samuel's face. "I don't blame you, Samuel. Not for any of it. I brought this on us," he said, the guilt still heavy in his chest. "No, Whitfield brought this on himself." Ruth's voice grew stronger. "I lived in fear every day that man walked the earth. Now his name will be cursed in songs. That's worth something." 3 more days of hard travel brought them to a small settlement of free blacks and sympathetic Quakers. They were given food and fresh clothes, and a place to rest in a hidden cellar beneath a barn. 2 more groups of escaped slaves joined them there, 15 people in all now. One night, an old man with graying hair visited their hiding place. He spoke with Aunt Millie in hushed tones, then addressed the group. "I'm Thomas. I'll guide you across the Ohio River tomorrow night. From there, you'll follow the drinking gourd to the next safe house." That night, no one slept. The promise of crossing into free territory kept them alert, anxious, hopeful. Ruth insisted on sitting up for the first time, though Samuel worried about her strength. "I want to walk across," she told him, "not be carried. I want to walk into freedom on my own 2 feet." At dusk the next day, Thomas led them to the river's edge. The Ohio stretched wide before them, its waters dark and swift in the fading light. On the far shore lay the Free State. "There's a boat hidden in those reeds," Thomas whispered, pointing. "Take only 4 at a time. Return the boat for the others." Samuel helped Ruth stand. Her legs trembled with weakness, but her face showed fierce determination. "I can make it," she insisted. The first group crossed safely. Aunt Millie, Martha, Will, and one of the new arrivals. Then the boat returned. Samuel and Ruth went in the second crossing, with Isaac and Jeremiah rowing. The current pulled at them, threatening to sweep them downriver. Samuel held Ruth tightly as water splashed into the small boat. The distant shore seemed impossibly far. "Almost there," Jeremiah whispered, straining against the oars. When the boat finally bumped against the northern bank, Samuel lifted Ruth in his arms despite her protests. He carried her up the muddy slope and set her down only when they reached solid ground. Ruth's fingers dug into the soil. "Free," she whispered, looking up at Samuel with tears in her eyes. "Is it real?" Samuel knelt beside her, taking a handful of the same earth. It felt no different from the soil of Virginia, yet everything had changed. No one owned this ground they touched. No one owned them. The others joined them as each boat returned, until all 15 stood on the northern shore. Exhausted, They collapsed beneath a large oak tree, its branches spreading above them like protective arms. Ruth leaned against Samuel's chest, her breathing steady now. "What will we do?" she asked. "Where will we go?" Samuel looked up at the stars, the same stars that had guided them north, the same stars that had shone over Whitfield's burning mansion, the same stars that watched over their child's tiny grave. "We'll live," he said simply. "We'll build something that's ours." The small settlement of Hope's Landing sat nestled between rolling hills and a clear running stream. Wooden cabins with smoke curling from chimneys dotted the landscape. Fields of corn and wheat stretched toward the horizon. Here, free black families had built a community over the past decade. Some born free, others who had purchased their freedom, and some who had fled like Samuel and Ruth. 6 weeks had passed since they crossed the Ohio River. Their journey north had been slow and careful, moving from safe house to safe house, always watching for slave catchers. Ruth's strength returned gradually, though she remained thin, her eyes carrying shadows of their losses. The people of Hope's Landing welcomed them without many questions. They understood what it meant to arrive with nothing but scars and determination. "This cabin's been empty since the Thompsons moved west," said Abigail Green, the settlement's unofficial leader. She was a tall woman with gray-streaked hair who had been free all her life. "It needs work, but the roof's sound." Samuel stood in the doorway of the one-room cabin. Sunlight streamed through cracks in the walls. The floor was packed dirt, and a small stone fireplace took up one wall. It was smaller than the slave quarters they had shared with 3 other families, but it was theirs alone. "We can fix it," he said, turning to Ruth, who leaned against the doorframe. "What do you think?" Ruth stepped inside, running her hand along the rough wooden wall. "It's perfect," she whispered. Aunt Millie had continued further north with some of the others, heading for Canada, where slave catchers couldn't follow. Before leaving, she had pressed something into Samuel's palm. Seeds, bean, corn, and squash seeds she had carried all the way from Virginia. "For new beginnings," Martha had translated. Their first days at Hope's Landing passed in a blur of work. The community helped them patch the cabin walls with mud and straw. They were given a corn husk mattress, cooking pots, and enough food to last until they could provide for themselves. Samuel found work helping build a new barn for the settlement. His strength and carpentry skills, learned in secret on the plantation, made him valuable. For the first time, someone paid him for his labor, coins placed directly into his palm, not into a master's pocket. Ruth began working in the settlement's garden, though her movements were still slow and careful. At night, they would sit by their own fire, sometimes not speaking for hours, just feeling the weight of freedom and loss. "I keep waiting," Ruth said one evening, staring into the flames, "for someone to tell us to go back to the quarters, for a whip to crack." Samuel took her hand. "No one owns us here." "My body knows that," she said, "but my mind still jumps at shadows." 2 months into their new life, Samuel marked out a small plot of land behind their cabin. The settlement had allotted each family a parcel for their own garden. He worked the soil each evening after returning from the barn raising. Ruth watched him from the cabin doorway. "What are you thinking about when you work the earth like that?" Samuel's hands stilled on the hoe. "About Virginia," he admitted. "About blood in the soil there." Ruth came to him then, her steps steadier than they had been in months. "And here? What will grow in this soil?" "Life," he said. "Just life." Their neighbors taught them the rhythms of northern seasons, so different from Virginia. Winter would come harder here, they warned. Samuel chopped extra wood, and Ruth learned to preserve food in the root cellar they dug beneath the cabin floor. Some nights, Samuel still woke sweating and shaking, Whitfield's dying face before his eyes. On those nights, Ruth would hold him, her fingers tracing the old whip scars on his back. "Do you regret it?" she asked him once. "What you did?" Samuel stared into the darkness. "I regret what it cost us," he said finally, "but not that he's gone from this world." One morning, Samuel heard singing from the far side of the settlement, a familiar melody that made his blood run cold. He followed the sound to find a group of newly arrived fugitives. One man sang softly while mending a shoe. Master thought his power strong, but the slave husband proved him wrong. When the master touched his wife, Samuel Carter took his life. The singer looked up, noticing Samuel's frozen stance. "You know this song?" Samuel couldn't speak. "It's spreading all through the South," the man continued. "Overseers hate it. Try to beat it out of anyone they catch singing it. Makes them afraid, knowing what happened to Whitfield." That night, Samuel told Ruth about the song. "Our pain has become a warning to others," she said, her hand resting on her empty belly. "Maybe that gives meaning to what we lost." By early autumn, their cabin was weather-tight. With a wooden floor, Samuel had laid himself. A small table stood in one corner with 2 chairs, the first furniture Samuel had ever owned. On the wall hung a simple drawing Ruth had made of plants and herbs, knowledge she'd carried from the plantation. Their garden flourished. The beans climbed tall poles, corn stalks reached for the sky, and squash spread across the ground. Aunt Millie's seeds had taken root in the free soil. The harvest came, and for the first time, they gathered crops that belonged entirely to them. No overseer counted their bushels. No master claimed the best portions. On a crisp October morning, Samuel rose before dawn. Frost glittered on the ground as he walked to the garden, carrying a small pouch of seeds he had saved from their first harvest. These would be planted in the spring, their second growing season as free people. The eastern sky lightened to pale pink as he knelt in the soil. Samuel worked with careful hands, preparing a small section of ground for winter rye that would keep the soil rich until spring planting. He didn't hear Ruth approach until her hand touched his shoulder. "You're up early," she said, her breath visible in the cold air. "Couldn't sleep. Wanted to finish this before the day's work." Ruth knelt beside him, her fingers joining his in the soil. They worked in silence as the sun broke over the horizon, casting long shadows behind them. "This land is ours now," Ruth whispered after a while. "No master's shadow remains." Samuel looked at his wife's face in the dawn light. The hollows in her cheeks had filled out. The fear that had lived behind her eyes for so long had dimmed, though it might never completely vanish. He took her hand, both their palms dark with soil. "We plant for ourselves now," he said, "and for those who come after." Ruth leaned against him, "and for the one who never had the chance." Together they pressed the last seeds into the earth, covering them gently. What would grow from this soil would be theirs alone, the fruit of free hands working free land. The blood oath that had carried them here was fulfilled, not in vengeance alone, but in this quiet creation of new life. I hope you found that story powerful. Leave a like on the video and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. I have handpicked 2 stories for you that are even more powerful. Have a great day.